journey to lost civilizations. See ancient artifacts and long-lost ancient scrolls.
The strange writing on this clay brick is known as cuneiform. Now, the script was used for
Take the journey of a lifetime and travel to ancient Babylon and the island of Patmos to discover how ancient mysteries reveal the future. A live seminar series. Don't miss any program.
So we begin our presentation this evening by taking us on a journey back to the year 332 BC. And the story goes that after Alexander the Great, remember last night we talked about thighs of bronze. Alexander the Great, after he destroyed the Phoenician city of Tyre, the story goes that he was on his way to Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem. And the story goes that when Alexander went to Jerusalem to destroy the city, he was met by some Jewish priests. And the Jewish priests basically showed King Alexander a prophecy, a prediction in the old Hebrew scriptures that foretold the rise of the kingdom of Grecia. Have some of you heard this story before? Well, it's a true story. And so what happened was these Jewish priests actually revealed to Daniel this ancient prediction or prophecy that we find in the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly in chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. And so these Jewish priests revealed to King Alexander, hey, did you know that your kingdom was actually predicted by Jehovah God in the Old Testament? So, the story goes when King Alexander read this prophecy and he saw that his nation and himself was actually described in the ancient documents, he actually spared Jerusalem from destroying it. So he didn't destroy it because of this prophecy. So the question I want to ask this evening is, why did this prophecy change his mind? What was so important about this prophecy that made Alexander say, you know what, I'm not going to destroy this city, and we're going to look at that this evening. But before we do, I want us to take a journey even further back to 2,000 years ago, to a city called Jerusalem. Anyone know what Jerusalem means in the Hebrew tongue? We have a very good audience. I shouldn't ask and look at Bryn because he's a very intelligent man here. But it comes from a joint word of Jeru Shalom. Shalom in Hebrew is peace, city of peace. But we all know this evening that it is not the city of peace, is it? In fact, it is the most fought over real estate in this world today, because 3 world religions claim it as their birthplace. The Jews, rightfully so, and the Muslims claim a piece to this territory, and also modern day Christians would like to see their ancestry back to Jerusalem. So although there's an irony on the play of words, it's the city of peace, but in some ways it is the most fought over piece of real estate in the world today. And so as we look at the story of Jerusalem, you'll notice a model depiction here. Back in the 1st century BC, right on the Temple Mount stood Herod's temple, or the sanctuary. And this was, I guess, the pride of the Jewish nation. This was kind of like me, coming from Australia, and, the Opera House, the Harbour Bridge, when I have my cousins, my family visiting from all parts of the world, I'll take them to the city and I'll show them Darling Harbour and I'll show them the Opera House there. Look at this beautiful place, look at this wonderful city of Sydney. If you were a Jew back in the days of Jerusalem, of the days of Jesus, the Jewish temple was the pride of the Jewish nation. And so Herod actually built this particular temple. And if you go to the surrounding areas there, you go to the city of Caesarea, these are the remains of where once stood Herod's palace. And we also see there on the left, this image on my left, is the aqueduct, which was a channel where we channeled water from a spring 7 kilometers north of the city. And also, if you get a chance to go to this part of the world, you'll notice that Herod actually built a lot of fortresses. You see, Herod, like many men who had a lot of power and wealth, was a very, very paranoid character. He was always fearful that someone was going to overtake his empire. So he would build these fortresses way out in the desert where no one could, I guess if he was under siege by an army or an invading nation, that he would be able to, I guess, withstand the assaults of these surrounding nations. So on the left there, he built one called the Herodian fortress near Bethlehem. And the visual there on my right is the great fortress of Masada. In fact, there was a movie some years ago about this story of Masada. Some of you probably watched that old Hollywood flick. And that is situated there by the Dead Sea there in Jordan. And so what is so significant about this temple? Well, you see, 2,000 years ago, Jesus, with his disciples, was sitting there, and Jesus had disciples, and they would be following Jesus, and they were looking out at this beautiful temple that existed some 2,000 years ago. And as they were looking at the temple, Jesus said these fascinating things. It actually rocked their Jewish minds, because in their minds, this city would stand forever. And so Jesus said these words in the biblical account. Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, can I ask you a question this evening? Do you think that the Jews that were living with Jesus, the disciples, do you think they were ready to hear what Jesus had just said? Absolutely not. Jesus was basically shattering their paradigm of their nationalistic ideology. That basically the temple that represented who they were as a nation would be basically destroyed. In fact, Jesus, and the reason why we have this in tonight's presentation, because we're talking about ancient mysteries revealing the future, right? And so what I want to share with you is that Jesus predicted the downfall and the destruction of his very own city. I think that's very important. And so when he was sitting out there in the Mount of Olives, anyone been to Jerusalem by the way? You've been everywhere, haven't you? I named all these countries last night, and my sister here at the front, she said, "Yeah, I've been there, lovely." And so when you go over there, it's a wonderful picture of Jerusalem. As Jesus sat there on the Mount of Olives, the disciples replied with this question. And by the way, what I'm reading on the screen, you can find it right there in your Bible, in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew. You can read it in your own time, but I need to skip along. The disciples asked this question, "Tell us, Jesus, when will these things be?" And so when Jesus begins to outline the response, he basically tells a few things in his response. He has predictions concerning Jerusalem. He also talks about the temple, and he also talks about the Jewish nation. And so I just want to kind of run through the predictions that Jesus spoke when the disciples asked Jesus this question some 2,000 years ago. The first thing that Jesus predicted is that Jerusalem would be surrounded by an embankment or a wall, and it would actually be destroyed. That was what Jesus had predicted. And if you notice what Jesus said in the biblical account, he says here, "Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it." This is Jesus. He's weeping over the city of Jerusalem. Why? Because he goes on to say, "The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you." In other words, Jesus is saying there's going to come a time when your city is going to be surrounded by enemies. Surround you and close you in on every side and level you, and your children will within you to the ground. This is a prediction of Jesus. He said that one day this city will be surrounded by a wall, and your children within you, it will level you. Basically, there will be utter destruction. That's what Jesus is predicting. And so as Jesus sat there on the Mount of Olives, and as they overlooked the city of Jerusalem, and they oversaw the beautiful temple there, it was the disciples just had absolutely no clue about what Jesus was predicting. And then if you find back in the biblical account, Jesus says here, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Some of you know these verses. Some of this is the first time. It's great. He says, "Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. See, your house," he's talking about the temple, "is left to you desolate. Now, I just want you to just pause and hear the ethos, the passion coming from Jesus. You see, Jesus was, as you'll see in our next presentation, he was the promised Messiah that was supposed to come to the Jewish nation. But they basically rejected him. And so this was like right at the end of Jesus' ministry. And he basically says to them, your house is left you desolate. I've done everything I can to reach you, but you would not let me help you. And so he said, how often I would have loved to gather you as a mother hen gathers her chicks. And so when Jesus leaves this temple, by the way, if you know the biblical story, there's a story when Jesus was 12 years old. And he's in the temple. And he calls the temple my Father's house. 33 and a half, when he's 33, when he enters into his ministry, when he leaves the temple, he says, your house. Israel had rejected Jesus as their Messiah. And when Jesus left that temple, he never returned. He said, your house is left to you desolate. And then Jesus goes on in that same chapter, in verse 2, not one stone here will be left on another. Now this is a fascinating prediction. Because when you look at the city of the temple, Jerusalem, you will notice that the stones that were made to build this temple was of immense size. Can you actually see that picture there? How huge these stones were. Some of them were as long as 20 meters, as wide as 2 meters, and thick 3 meters thick. And so these stones were of immense size. And what did Jesus say? There'll be coming a time where this temple will be destroyed. And so what's another prediction that Jesus spoke about the temple? He says, thirdly, that the Jews were to fall by the sword. In other words, the Jews would be destroyed as a people. And so Jesus says in the biblical account in the book of Luke, he says there'll be great distress in the land and wrath against this people, and they will fall by the sword. That's what Jesus predicted. And the story says in the biblical account when Jesus made his way through what many Christians would call the Via Dolorosa, when he made his way through and on his way to Golgotha where he would give his life, we are told there that he said, and a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. So there was a great procession, people crying, Jesus, why are you giving your life? Jesus, stop hitting him, stop bludgeoning him. But what did Jesus do? Jesus turning to them, he said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming. This is Jesus predicting what would happen. The days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. In other words, Jesus is saying, there's becoming a time when then you would not want to be living in what is about to take place. So picture in your mind, Jesus is about to be crucified on a cross. He's not worried about himself. He's saying, you should weep for yourselves because there's coming a time when this city is going to be surrounded by armies and your very children are going to perish. That's what Jesus is predicting. Right there in the gospel account. What did Jesus also predict? He predicted that the Jews were to be scattered among the nations. And so back in the biblical record in the book of Luke, Jesus says these words, that they will fall by the sword and they'll be taken as prisoners to all the nations. See again, if you're a Jew, when God had forsaken you, so to speak, in the scriptures, one thing that they would happen to them, they would be overtaken by pagan nations, and more so, they would actually be dispersed throughout the land. And so it was almost like a judgment upon them by God. So that's what also Jesus predicted. Jesus also predicted that the Gentiles, or non-Jews, were to inhabit Jerusalem. In fact, we go back to the book of Luke there, where it tells us in Luke chapter 21, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So I'm just kind of laying the foundation this evening that Jesus made some very, very clear predictions about his own city and about the temple. That's what we're looking at in these few moments. So the question I want to ask this evening is, were they actually fulfilled? It's one thing for Jesus to say all these things, but can we look at history, can we look at archaeology, and can we see that Jesus' words that he said some 2,000 years ago, did they actually come to pass? And the reason why I ask this question is if it did come to pass, I am suggesting to you, referring to our presentation last night, that the biblical documents are historically accurate and they can be trusted. That's the whole reason why I'm sharing all these things. So that when we look at the words of Jesus, if he said something and it happened, then we can have absolute confidence in what he's saying. And if we can have confidence in what he's saying about the future, if I can bring it a little bit closer to home, we could have confidence in our own very lives. So, you need to hang in there. So how did this all happen? Did these predictions of Jesus actually come true? Well, if you notice back in 66 AD, 35 years later, after Jesus had predicted these things back there on the Mount of Olives, there was a fellow by the name of Gessius Florus, and he was the procurator of Judea. And how the war began between the Jews and the Romans is that Gessius Florus, back in 66 AD, introduced a temple tax. So he was basically taxing the Jewish believers, the priests, to pay money to the Romans. And so some of them didn't like that, and so there was a war that broke out, and some of the Jews in the temple killed some of the Roman garrisons that were stationed right there in the city. And so this is what actually began this conflict between the Jews and the Romans. It's actually a fascinating historical account of all the wars that have been subsequent between the Jews and the Romans. And so part of that, I guess, start of the initial war between the Jews and the Romans is that some of the Jewish zealots, they took Masada from the Romans. You see, Herod actually built Masada, the fortress, but the Romans came and invaded and took it as theirs. But when this fighting broke out in 66 AD, the zealots kind of like, jumping on this, this momentum, they went back to Masada and they kicked some of the Roman garrisons that were stationed there, and they basically took and reoccupied that place. This is all the start of the tension between the Jews and the Romans. You see, Herod built this fortress. I don't know if you can see that picture there, but it was right there at the edge of the cliff face. I had the privilege of going there last year in September, and we got to stand there and we got to hear the stories of the fascinating things that transpired in Masada. And so if you can see there in the circle that his fortress was basically built right on the edge of the cliff face. It's not a place to live if you're scared of heights. You wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and kind of look out and just a bit of a 300-400 meter drop. And as you can see, this is another picture, a bird's eye view, I guess, of Herod's, of Masada. He had a spectacular view overlooking the Dead Sea. So this is where Masada, where Herod would actually come to when he was, I guess, trying to escape from his enemies. So the story goes that after this revolt took place in 66 AD, Cestius Gallus starts to pick up the campaign and said, you know what, these Jewish, they're just such a problem, we need to get rid of them. So they called Cestius Gallus along, and along with 30,000 soldiers to deal with this revolt. And so Cestius comes along and says, you need to wipe out and exterminate these Jews who are causing problems in our empire. But something spectacular happened right there when Cestius was about to destroy the Jews in Jerusalem. We have to come back to Christ's warning about this prophecy, because Jesus actually said these words. He said, when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, remember Jesus predicting the city, right? Destroyed. But he actually gives an option for those who are listening of how they can escape the destruction. He says, when you shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that it's, what's that next word, friends? Knows that its desolation is near. So Jesus is saying, if you're living in the city of Jerusalem, you're in the temple, and you see these armies surrounding the city, you better know that something's going to happen. Desolation is near. Then listen to what Jesus says. He says, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the country region go into it. So Jesus is basically saying, guess what? When you see the city of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the desolation is near. But then he said, if you're in the mountains, flee to the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And so Jesus is basically giving them a prediction. When you see it happen, be careful, something's going to happen. So the question is, how do you flee a city when it is surrounded? How can you flee? Well, Jesus is saying to flee, but how can you flee when they're surrounding the city? Well, if you notice what happened in history, when Cestius Gallus and the Roman soldiers were surrounding the city, something providential happened. There was noise and rumor of a war that was happening in another part of the Roman Empire. So Cestius and all of his Roman army basically just took up and left the city of Jerusalem. Left it wide open. And what happened at this place? The Jews who were there, they opened the city gates, and you know what they did? They went after Cestius and his army. Hey, come back here! They went up to him, and they basically almost slaughtered Cestius' army. And so as these Jews went out, the zealots went out to destroy Cestius' army as they're trying to run off to another battle. The Christians who were still in the city of Jerusalem, it was their sign to leave. It's exactly what happened. In fact, the Christians fled to a place called Pella. These are the archaeological remains of where the city of Pella once stood, over there near Jordan. Can you see the prediction? Jesus says, when you see the surrounding, flee. And when the Romans under Cestius left for that minor moment, they came back. It was their opportunity to leave. Then what happened next in the story? Well, after Cestius left, you see, at the time there was an emperor by the name of Nero. And Emperor Nero had died. And so when Emperor Nero died, the next emperor that would take his place was Emperor Vespasian. And so Vespasian was ordered to take up this work of dealing with the Jews. But then Vespasian actually gave the work of dealing with the Jews to his son Titus. And this is where Nero dies, Vespasian becomes emperor, so his son Titus is called to end this in revolt. And what happened? Titus, and you can search this out in history, Titus is known in history as the one who ends up besieging Jerusalem, and in AD 70, the city of Jerusalem is actually destroyed. How did Titus destroy the Jews? Well, he did it through starvation, basically. He starved the Jews to death. And what did he do? And by the way, this is an exact prediction of what Jesus said. And by the way, AD 70, when did Jesus die? It was somewhat 40 years after Jesus' prediction, AD 70. What did Titus do? He built a 5-mile earthen rampart or a wall around Jerusalem, just as Jesus predicted. He built a wall around the city. In fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he says in his records that over 1 million Jews perished in this siege. 1 million Jews. They all perished in this siege. And the Jews suffered terribly. If you read the historical accounts, what Vespasian and what Titus would do is they would destroy all the cities and villages on the way. And so only place where all the people could run to was Jerusalem, and he basically cornered all of the Jews in the city. Surrounded the city, and he said, we'll wait till they come out. And if you read some of the records of what happened in the city, it got so dark and gruesome, they basically turned to cannibalism. The Jews, the women, the parents started eating the flesh of their children. I'm not making this up, because they were so stubborn they would not relinquish to the Romans. They stayed in the city and they basically ate each other to death until finally something dramatic happened. Got to keep going. The Jews' last stand was in the temple. And if you can see this building over here on the right of the picture, this is what we call the Fortress of Antonia. Now, what was that? It was built by the Romans because they understood it was built high enough so they could overlook the temple, because if any revolt or anything bad would happen, it would start in the temple. So it was kind of like they were keeping watch over it. But Titus said to the Romans, I don't want you to destroy the temple because it's a beautiful monument. It's wonderful, it's magnificent. Please do whatever you like, but do not destroy the actual temple. But you know, the Roman soldiers didn't listen. In fact, the Jews and the Romans hated each other. And so the story goes that one of the Roman soldiers threw a firebrand over into the temple and caught a light in the fire, and basically within a few moments the whole temple of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount and the temple, was actually burning, and it was set alight, and basically the whole temple was on fire, destroyed. And the Romans came in, they plundered all of the vessels and the artifacts that were inside the temple. They took them and they bludgeoned all the survivors to death. They all died. They all died there in the city. In fact, if you go to Israel today, you will see some of the remaining stones that were torn down as a result of Titus's siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. In fact, Jesus' prediction is true. When Jesus said there will not be one stone left upon another, in fact, if you go to Jerusalem today, it's just level ground. In fact, there's only one Islamic building there, the Dome of the Rock, claimed by the Muslim community, and that's the only thing that stands there today. Before that, it was desolate, just as Jesus had predicted. And in fact, just to emphasize the truth of Titus's victory, if you go to the Roman Forum in Rome, you'll notice, you'll walk through this arch here. It's called the Arch of Titus. And Titus actually built this arch to commemorate his victory over the Jews in AD 70. And if you look a little bit closer, you'll see under the arch there that you can see some of the carvings there of the Romans actually taking the 7-branch candlestick from the very temple that was there in the Temple of Jerusalem, in the temple. And so it was kind of like a commemoration of what Titus had done in destroying the temple. And in fact, today, there is no temple there today, just as Jesus predicted. So, they all were destroyed in the city. Guess what? There were still some remaining Jews left. The ones that were able to flee out of there, they went to MASADA, and this is where they took their last stand. It's a fascinating story. In fact, the story goes that there were some 900 Jewish zealots and families that remained. They rushed back to MASADA, kind of like, this is our last stand. And it was the most nationalistic, the most Jewish, pride, zealot-filled men and women and families took their stand up there in MASADA. And if you notice there, if you've ever been to MASADA, you'll notice it was led by Flavius Silva. What they would do is they built, Flavius with the Romans, they built a whole wall around the fortress so that no one would escape, kind of like blocking them in so that they would retreat. And just right on the side of the mountains, they would have Roman camps where the Roman soldiers would literally live there and camp there and would strategize how to get these Jews out of MASADA. In fact, one of the things they used to do is they would build these siege ramps. And what they would do is they look at the shorter side of the mountain and they build these ramps so that they could hurl these gigantic stones and hopefully break the walls of MASADA. And if you could look at some of these stones here, you can go to MASADA today and you will see some of these. Look how big those rocks are. They're huge. And they will catapult them over, hoping they'll knock the walls of MASADA down. And if you look at this picture here, this is what some of those rocks did. It would basically break the whole exterior of MASADA. But what is so fascinating about this story is it's a fascinating story that when they knew that the Romans were basically going to come in there and destroy them, the story goes that the commander of the zealots basically led them into this synagogue. This is where they had a little synagogue here. And he basically gave them a stirring speech. He said, we're not going to surrender to the Romans. We're going to rather take our lives. And we are Jewish people. And how dare they? We are God's people. He gave them a stirring speech. And you know what they did next? Archaeologists discovered there that they found these pottery sherds. And what they suggest is that in this group of men, they would write down their names. And it was kind of like they were casting lots. And they would cast lots of those who would kill the remaining men that were alive. And so they would basically passed these lots and they had these names. This is what they're suggesting. The reason why we know these stories is when the Romans came, there was actually only 2 women and some children alive. And they were the ones that told the story of how all the men had died. And so when the Romans came in the next day to overtake the people of Masada, there was total silence there because everyone was dead. Because they didn't want them to be enslaved by the Romans. They didn't want them to be subjugated to them. So they ended up taking their very own lives. Fascinating story. But the Jews are a fighting nation. They still wanted to revolt against Rome. And so back in 135 AD, the Jews revolted again, or what is called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And during this time, they were revolting against the Emperor Hadrian and against Rome. And so what Hadrian did is he basically expelled them from Jerusalem. So this was basically their last, port of call. They were extradited and told to be removed from Jerusalem. And so the Jews would be scattered around the world. Just as Jesus predicted, he'd be scattered around the world. And so now, when you look at Israel today, there's predominantly quite a mixture of Gentiles or non-Jews who are living in Jerusalem today. And now Palestinian Arabs control the Temple Mount. And by the way, if you keep coming to our meetings, this will be a very vital topic in biblical prophecy. What goes on in that temple? So you have to keep coming to our presentation. So, Christ's predictions are exactly fulfilled. But the most fascinating prediction that was predicted by Jesus is found back there in the book of Daniel, in chapter 8 and chapter 9. And Jesus actually says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by who, everybody? Daniel the prophet. By the way, do you know that the book of Daniel is the only book that Jesus mentions by name in all of the scriptures? He mentions, when you see this happening, spoken by Daniel, whoso readeth, let him understand. And I think if Jesus thought it was important to mention the disciples, I think it's important for us to study it in our day and age. So Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, and we're going to explain that in a moment. I know it sounds like, what on earth is that talking about? We'll explain in a few moments. When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whosoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, you remember just last night, some of you were here last night, we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We talked about the fact that they could see that the Dead Sea Scrolls dated to 100 to 200 BC, over 2,100 years old. Well, part of those Dead Sea Scrolls is the ancient prediction. And we see there an ancient prediction in the book of Daniel, chapter 8. And we find there in the book of Daniel a great war between a ram and a goat. And I'll explain what this means in just a moment. So what do we find here? You see Daniel again, and he's receiving a dream. Remember last night we talked about the dream of the statue, Daniel chapter 2? Chapter 8, Daniel is receiving another dream. And God interprets it to him what this dream meant. Daniel chapter 8, verse 20. The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of who, everybody? Media and Persia. So basically the story is Daniel sees a vision of a ram and a goat, and they basically butt heads, and one destroys the other. And Daniel is being explained the dream. He says, that ram which you saw, that's Medo-Persia. And then the vision continues. And the male goat is the kingdom of who, everybody? Greece. This is the prophecy that the priest showed Alexander. He said, right there in the scripture, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And listen, Alexander would have just loved to hear this. And he says, the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. Referencing to Alexander himself. And so, right there in the book of Daniel, there is an ancient prediction that predicted not only Medo-Persia, but it predicted Greece. Just like Daniel was told back in the book of Daniel chapter 2. And then the story continues in the vision. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king, and the horn is represented as Alexander. By the way, in prophecy, you're going to notice as you keep coming to our seminars, you're going to hear a lot of animals and beasts, and these are references to nations. And so when Daniel was seeing two animals, a ram and a goat, it's a symbol of two nations were fighting. Okay? Just to kind of throw it out there. It's not literal, these are symbolic meanings behind it. So Alexander the Great, he was the first, he was the king symbolized by the horn. But we've got to keep going on. It says there, therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken. Talking about the fact that King Alexander's kingdom would be destroyed very soon. And notice what happens next in the vision. The large horn was broken, and in place of it, how many horns came up? Well, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood upon its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. You see, when Alexander died, the story goes that when he died, he basically, his 4 generals assumed, control of the kingdom of Greece. You see, King Alexander actually had a son, but he didn't entrust his son to be the next ruler. So the tradition says that when he was lying on his deathbed, and they said, "Who will the kingdom of Greece be given to you?" And he said, "To the strongest." So all of his generals fought, and basically came down to 4 generals that ended up resuming the kingdom of Greece as it was divided, just as the prophecy predicted. So the 4 generals fought for control of his empire back in 301 BC. But something fascinating happened after this, the kingdom of Greece. It says 4 notable ones, or horns, came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them, out of one of the 4 winds, one of the 4 points of the compass, came what, everyone? A little horn, which grew exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. I'm going to explain all this in just a moment. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. And the place of his sanctuary was cast down. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. Now, what does that all mean? Let me try and explain it to you. The Bible says that this prediction would be that after Greece and after the 4 generals, there will be a little horn or a power that would operate. And if you look at this little horn power, who does this little horn represent? If you look at it through the history, you will know that this little horn is the power of Rome. Okay? Now remember in last night's story, we saw the legs of iron represented who, everybody? Represented Rome, right? So here's the story of Daniel. Daniel sees a ram and a goat. They hit heads. And out of the horn is Alexander's horn. Here's the horn. It's broken. Out of them have 4 horns. Out of one of them, meaning the 4 directions of the compass, arises a little horn power. And that little horn power is Rome. Now, if you look at and notice the actions of the little horn, this is why we can say, without a doubt, that the little horn power in Daniel chapter 8 is a symbol for Rome. And here's why. Because when you read the chapter, it says a few things about this little horn power. Number 1, it was predicted that this little horn power would go south. Now we all know that Rome went and invaded Egypt. That everybody knows that. Number 2, we notice in this little horn power that this little horn went east. Or in other words, it went to Mesopotamia. We also know about this little horn that it went to Israel, or as it says in the prophecy, the glorious land. That's what the symbolism means. It would go to Israel. And so we notice there that it would go to Israel as well. But number 4 here, it actually says it will be greater than Greece, because it actually says this little horn will be exceedingly great. That's what the Bible actually predicted about this little horn power. But the last one I think is fascinating. And again, in our future lectures, we're going to go into details when we talk about the mark of the beast. We talk about these power in the end time. One of the actions of this little horn is that it would stand against Jesus Christ. Very important. So you don't want to miss if you get our brochure on your way out, and you look for the program on the Mark of the Beast and the Antichrist power, you won't want to miss that. So, we know that all these little horn power represents Rome. Because we know that it was the Roman power that was the ruling power that basically put Jesus on the cross. And we also know that this little horn power would cast down the sanctuary or the temple to the ground. And that was symbolized when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. And it also took away the daily temple services. And that's exactly what happened. When Rome destroyed the temple, their daily sacrifices, as Daniel predicted, it stopped. And if you've been reading anything, what's going on in the religious world, do you know what Jews want to do today? They want to see the temple reinstituted in Jerusalem. And it's a fascinating thing when you read it with the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. It's all coming to a climax. And you don't want to miss these nights because it'll all be explained in our Ancient Mysteries seminar. It also says that it will trample on God's people. And we know that it trampled on God's people because we all know in history what the Romans did. Some of us don't like to remember what happened back there of what historians call the Dark Ages, when Christians were basically persecuted for their faith in Jesus. And you will know when you read books like Fox's Book of Martyrs that Christians were basically taken to the Colosseum as entertainment. They would be thrown to the lions and they would be basically killed, and this was entertainment for the Romans. And so this little on power, the Romans, would actually destroy the Christians. Actually, scholars suggest that over 50 million Christians were persecuted during what they call the Dark Ages period. Why do I share all that this evening? Simply to say this. The predictions that we find in the book of Daniel, the predictions that Jesus predicted some 2,000 years ago, I'm bringing it back to this point. It is historically accurate. You see, what Jesus said some 2,000 years ago, it happened. Jesus said the city would be destroyed. What happened? It was destroyed. This prophecy we read in Daniel, it said this little horn power would arise, and guess what it will do? It will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've just explained that's what it's done. And it's all for a reason, friends. It's to let you know that the book that we would call today, and I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm a Christian. And I believe in the book of what we call the Bible. And the Bible is not a bunch of fairy tales. It's not a bunch of myths and legends. It is historical, verifiable, and it is accurate. And archaeology supports this. And we can trust the historical accuracy of the Bible. And another reason why we're sharing these things tonight is because I would like to say to you that it has a proven track record of dependable predictions. And so if you're coming in tonight to talk about what does the future hold, how can I know the future, how can I make sense of all the craziness going around in our world, I simply point to you to have an honest and open look at the biblical document and ask yourself and test it to see if it is verified and if it is truly backing up what it is saying. And we shared that in a very clear way last night when we looked at the 4 world empires in the book of Daniel. I'd like to suggest to you this evening that is the most reliable source for knowing the future. And I can also say, when I say this, I know that there's perhaps some of you here this evening who may have, questions about the biblical records. You may have questions about, about its validity and whatnot. That's fine. That's why we're running these seminars. So you can sit here every night and objectively listen to the presentations. We give you the summaries to take home, and then you go search it out. Don't believe me what I'm saying. You go and look at it for yourself. And so we're making these seminars available to put tools in your hands so that you can study it and see for yourself. Okay? I've got to wrap this first part up. So Christ's predictions have been exactly fulfilled. And so when we're talking about predictions, we're also talking about predictions concerning our time. And if you come to part 2, and I'm hoping that you're going to stay around for a little bit longer, we're going to have about a 10-minute break to have a bit of a drink, and you can go out and use the bathroom and whatnot. When we come back in 10 minutes, 15 minutes time, I'd like to take you to part 2. We're going to look at Pompeii and how near is the end. You see, what I've done in part 1 is basically looked at Jesus' predictions about Jerusalem, and we can see that it was true. I want to share with you things that we can see in our world at this very hour, and you can say without a doubt, if it's true and it was predicted, then surely we need to take up and take notice. Okay? So, I invite you this time to stand up, walk out, have a drink outside, and in about 10 minutes, please make your way back and we'll jump straight into the second presentation. Thank you so much.
Come on a journey to lost civilizations. See ancient artifacts and long-lost ancient scrolls.
The strange writing on this clay brick is known as cuneiform. Now, the script was
Hear
used
international presenter Gary Webster and travel with him to ancient Babylon and the island of Patmos to discover how ancient mysteries reveal the future. A free live international seminar series commencing June 16 across Auckland. For the nearest venue and bookings, visit am2017.co.nz or call 0800 AM 2017.